Sunday morning, May 16th, 1965. Churches across America are packed shoulder to shoulder. In one Presbyterian sanctuary in Louisville, Kentucky, the choir is singing, children are fidgeting in wooden pews, and the parking lot is so full that families are parking 3 blocks away. The pastor looks out at faces filling every corner of his church. He has no idea he's witnessing the peak, the absolute zenith. Because starting Monday morning, a slow-motion collapse is about to begin that will take 50 years to fully unfold, and by the time the dust settles, over 2.5 million people will have walked away from the Presbyterian Church. This isn't a story about scandal, though there was controversy. It isn't about one bad decision, though there were many. This is about something far more complex and far more terrifying for any institution. This is about death by 1,000 cuts. The number was staggering. 4.25 million members. That's what the Presbyterian Church USA could claim in 1965. They were America's establishment religion, the faith of presidents and senators, of university founders and business titans. John Witherspoon, the only clergyman to sign the Declaration of Independence, was Presbyterian. Woodrow Wilson's father was a Presbyterian minister. This wasn't some fringe denomination. These were the people who quite literally helped build America's institutions. Princeton University started as a Presbyterian school. So did Davidson College, Rhodes College, and dozens of others. The Presbyterians weren't just present at the founding of American democracy, they were architects. But something happened. Something that started so quietly that most people didn't even notice. Between 1965 and 1970, the church didn't just plateau, it began to shrink. Just a little at first. A few thousand here, a few thousand there. Church leadership held meetings, formed committees, published reports. They used words like reorganization and modernization. They told themselves this was temporary, a small dip in the road. They were wrong. By 1975, they'd lost 500,000 members. By 1985, another 500,000 gone. By 2000, the number kept falling. By 2020, the Presbyterian Church USA had just 1.2 million members left. They had lost nearly 3 million people. That's roughly the entire population of Chicago, just gone. Imagine every single person in Chicago deciding to leave something all at once, and you begin to understand the scale. So, what happened? What could cause such a massive, sustained exodus from one of America's most established religious institutions? The answer isn't simple, and that's what makes it fascinating. Because this wasn't a single explosive event. This was a slow unraveling, a denominational death spiral that everyone saw coming, but somehow nobody could stop. Let's rewind to 1967. The Presbyterian Church does something that seems innocuous to modern eyes but was revolutionary for its time. They adopted something called the Confession of 1967. Now, I know what you're thinking. A confession? How controversial could a confession be? Very controversial, it turns out. This wasn't just any confession. This was a theological document that reinterpreted how Presbyterians should read the Bible. The old confessions, documents like the Westminster Confession written in the 1640s, treated Scripture as the inerrant Word of God. Every word was divinely inspired, historically accurate, absolutely authoritative. The Confession of 1967 took a different approach. It argued that the Bible should be read through the lens of God's reconciling work in Jesus Christ. It acknowledged human elements in Scripture's composition. It suggested that cultural context mattered when interpreting ancient texts. For progressive Presbyterians, this was liberation. Finally, a major denomination was acknowledging that you could be intellectually honest and still be Christian. You didn't have to check your brain at the door. But for conservative Presbyterians, this was catastrophe. The foundation was crumbling. If the Bible wasn't absolutely authoritative on all matters, then what was? Where did authority come from? Who decided what was metaphor and what was literal? The questions opened a chasm that would never fully close. And the timing couldn't have been worse. Because 1967 wasn't just any year, this was the summer of love. The Vietnam War was raging and protests were erupting on college campuses. The civil rights movement was forcing America to confront its original sin. The sexual revolution was challenging every traditional assumption about morality and family. The counterculture was in full swing, and right in the middle of this cultural earthquake, the Presbyterian Church decided to revise its foundations. Some saw prophetic leadership, others saw surrender to secular culture. Both couldn't be right, but both groups stayed in the same church, glaring at each other across an ever-widening divide. Then came the women. In 1956, the Presbyterian Church had already taken the then radical step of ordaining women as ministers and elders. By the late 60s and early 70s, women were actually serving in these roles in increasing numbers. For many members, this was simple justice, an overdue correction of historical sexism. The Apostle Paul wrote about Phoebe the deacon and Priscilla the teacher. Women had always been part of Christian ministry. The church was just finally acknowledging it officially, but for others this violated clear biblical teaching. 1 Timothy chapter 2 verses 11 and 12. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. How do you reconcile that? The progressive answer was to contextualize it as Paul addressing specific problems in specific churches in the first century. The conservative answer was that God's word was being ignored for the sake of modern sensibilities. The churches started splitting along these fault lines. Not officially at first, but practically. Progressive congregations embraced female leadership and contemporary worship. Conservative congregations held firm to traditional interpretations and classical hymns. And both stayed nominally under the same denominational umbrella while having radically different Sunday morning experiences. But here's where it gets really interesting, because these weren't just theological debates happening in ivory towers. These were real people in real congregations watching their churches transform before their eyes. And the human cost was enormous. Families stopped speaking to each other. Lifelong friends found themselves on opposite sides of unbridgeable divides. Churches that had been pillars of their communities for 100 years split apart. I want you to imagine being a faithful Presbyterian who's attended the same church for 40 years. You were baptized there. You got married there. You've buried your parents there. And now, in the span of just a few years, everything feels different. The hymns are different. The sermons reference concepts you don't recognize. People are arguing about things you thought were settled. Do you stay and fight for what you believe in? Do you leave and find a church more aligned with your convictions? Do you just stop going altogether? Millions of Presbyterians faced exactly this choice. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we dig into the stories that shaped our world, the moments most people missed, and the truth hiding in plain sight. If you're finding value in this deep dive into religious history and institutional decline, consider leaving a super thanks. It helps us keep making detailed, well-researched content like this. Now, here's a question for you. Where in the world are you watching this from, and what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. I'm genuinely curious if our audience is having breakfast in Boston, lunch in London, or dinner in Dubai. And one more thing. What do you do for a living? I've noticed our audience spans from university professors to construction workers to stay-at-home parents, and I love that diversity. All right, back to the story. The year is 1978, and the Presbyterian Church makes another decision that sends shockwaves through the denomination. They definitively state that homosexual practice is not in accordance with biblical teaching, but, and this is crucial, they simultaneously affirm that homosexual persons are entitled to the same pastoral care and rights as anyone else. This middle position satisfied exactly nobody. Conservatives thought even discussing homosexual rights was capitulation. Progressives saw it as discriminatory and unjust. The resolution became a lightning rod, and for the next 3 decades, few issues would divide the church more bitterly. But something else was happening too. Something that had nothing to do with theology and everything to do with American culture. The 1960s had ushered in what sociologists call the decline of institutional authority. People were questioning everything: government, universities, corporations, and yes, churches. The generation coming of age in the 60s and 70s didn't automatically trust institutions the way their parents had. They wanted authenticity, not obligation. Experience, not ritual. Many were spiritual but not religious, a phrase that would become maddeningly common in the decades ahead. Church attendance became optional, even for people who still considered themselves Christian. Sunday morning baseball games, soccer practice, brunch with friends, all of these suddenly became acceptable alternatives to church. The social stigma of skipping church evaporated. The Presbyterian Church, with its formal liturgy, its emphasis on education and theological precision, its Presbyterian polity of committees and assemblies, was particularly vulnerable to the shift. Younger people wanted emotion and experience. They wanted to feel something. Many found that in charismatic churches with contemporary worship bands and casual dress codes. Others found it in Eastern religions or New Age spirituality. Still others found it in nothing at all, embracing secularism with the same fervor their grandparents had embraced Christianity. The numbers tell the story. In 1965, roughly 75% of Americans belonged to a church. By 2020, that number had dropped to 47%. Every denomination was hemorrhaging members, but mainline Protestant churches like the Presbyterians, Methodists, and Episcopalians were bleeding the worst. They'd tied their identity to cultural respectability and intellectual sophistication. When respectability no longer mattered and intellectualism became suspect, what did they have left? The evangelical churches offered certainty and emotional experience. The Catholic Church offered ancient ritual and sacramental mystery. The mainline Protestants offered committee meetings and thoughtful sermons about social justice. It's not hard to see which was more appealing to people seeking religious experience. Then came 1983, and the Presbyterian Church tried something audacious. The Presbyterian Church in the United States, known as the Southern Church, and the United Presbyterian Church in the United States of America, the Northern Church, decided to reunite after 122 years of separation. They'd split over slavery before the Civil War. Now they were coming back together, forming the Presbyterian Church USA. It was supposed to be a new beginning, a triumphant moment of reconciliation. Instead, it accelerated the decline. Why? Because the merger forced every congregation to confront their differences explicitly. Committees had to merge. Policies had to align. And when you put conservative Southern Presbyterians in the same room with progressive Northern Presbyterians and tell them to agree on doctrine and practice, you get conflict. Thousands of conservative congregations refused to join the merger at all. They formed or joined other denominations like the Presbyterian Church in America, which had split off in 1973 specifically to maintain conservative theology and practice. The PCA was thriving, growing year after year, even as the PCUSA was shrinking. The conservative congregations that did join the merger often lived in constant tension with denominational leadership, fighting over every policy decision, every theological statement, every penny of denominational funding. And the money became a huge issue. Here's something most people don't realize. When you join a Presbyterian congregation, your church sends a portion of its budget up to the presbytery, the regional governing body. The presbyteries send money to the General Assembly, the national leadership. That money funds mission work, seminaries, denominational programs, and national staff. But what happens when you fundamentally disagree with what your money is funding? What if your conservative Texas congregation discovers its offerings are funding a progressive advocacy group it considers heretical? What if your progressive Seattle congregation learns its money is supporting a mission board that won't ordain women or LGBTQ+ individuals? Congregations started withholding funds. Some redirected mission money to causes they personally supported. Others left the denomination entirely, but here's the catch. When you leave, the denomination claims ownership of your church property. That's right, the building your congregation built and maintained for decades. According to Presbyterian polity, it belongs to the denomination, held in trust. So leaving meant losing everything. Lawsuits erupted. Congregations fought presbyteries in court for years. Legal fees mounted. The bitterness intensified. Some congregations literally split in two, with one faction staying PCUSA in the building and another faction leaving to meet in rented space or new construction. The year 2011 brought everything to a head. The General Assembly voted to remove language from the Book of Order that had required ministers to live in fidelity within the covenant of marriage between a man and a woman, or chastity and singleness. This change effectively opened ordination to LGBTQ+ individuals. It had to be ratified by a majority of the 173 presbyteries, and the vote was agonizingly close. Some presbyteries voted by margins of just 1 or 2 votes. When the final tally came in 2011, the measure passed. The PCUSA became one of the first major Protestant denominations to allow openly LGBTQ+ clergy. For progressive Presbyterians, this was a justice issue, a civil rights triumph. They saw it as the church finally living up to Jesus' radical inclusion of the marginalized. For conservative Presbyterians, this was the last straw. The Bible was explicitly clear about sexual morality, they argued, and the church had just voted to ignore it. What you witnessed in the years following 2011 was a mass exodus. Entire congregations left en masse. In 2012 alone, more than 100 congregations departed to join the ECO, a new evangelical covenant order of Presbyterians. Others joined the Evangelical Presbyterian Church or became independent. The rate of decline, which had been steady for decades, suddenly accelerated. Let me give you some specific numbers because the scale is staggering. In 2012, the PCUSA had 1.95 million members. By 2022, just 10 years later, that number had dropped to 1.19 million. That's 760,000 people gone in a single decade. The church was losing an average of more than 76,000 members per year. That's like losing a mid-sized American city annually. Every year. For a decade. And it's still happening. The 2023 numbers showed continued decline. Entire presbyteries are folding. Seminaries are merging or closing. The denominational staff is being slashed. The Presbyterian Church USA is now in managed decline, and everyone knows it. But here's what makes this story so tragic and so fascinating. Nobody could stop it. It wasn't like there was some obvious solution everyone ignored. The progressive faction genuinely believed they were following Jesus' call to radical inclusion and justice. They looked at the church's history of supporting slavery, opposing women's rights, and marginalizing LGBTQ+ people, and they were determined not to be on the wrong side of history again. The conservative faction genuinely believed they were defending biblical authority and historic Christian teaching. They looked at churches that had abandoned traditional doctrine and saw dead, empty buildings that had become community centers or condos. Neither side was acting in bad faith. Both thought they were saving the church, and instead they destroyed it together. There's a heartbreaking irony here. The Presbyterians pioneered American democracy. Their system of representative government, with elected elders and assemblies and votes, literally influenced the framers of the Constitution. The system that made them great. Thoughtful deliberation, democratic process, mutual accountability, became the mechanism of their undoing. Because when you have a democratic system and two irreconcilable visions for the future, you get political warfare. General assemblies became battlegrounds. Presbyteries became voting blocks. Congregations became political pawns. The energy that should have gone into mission and ministry went into endless internal conflict. And the world just moved on. While Presbyterians were fighting over theology and sexuality and biblical interpretation, millions of Americans were simply leaving Christianity altogether. The rise of the nones, people who check none when asked about religious affiliation, has been one of the most significant demographic shifts in modern American history. In 1972, just 5% of Americans were nones. By 2021, that number had risen to 29%. These people aren't leaving for another church. They're leaving religion entirely, and the Presbyterian Civil War did nothing to stop that. If anything, it accelerated it. Who wants to join an organization that's constantly fighting with itself? Some of the departed churches thrived after leaving. The EKO congregations, freed from the denominational bureaucracy and theological fights, focused on mission and community. Many grew. The Presbyterian Church in America, which split off way back in 1973, has remained stable or even grown slightly. But the PCUSA keeps shrinking. The average age of a PCUSA member is now 60. Let that sink in. 60 years old. Churches are literally dying off. When members pass away, they're not being replaced. Children raised in these churches are leaving for other denominations or leaving faith altogether. The pipeline is broken. There are churches in this denomination with more people in their cemetery than in their pews. I'm not being metaphorical. There are small rural Presbyterian churches where 15 people show up on Sunday morning, most over the age of 70, and the church graveyard out back holds 300 previous members. They keep the lights on, they pay a part-time pastor, they hold their services, and everyone knows the church will close when the last member dies or becomes unable to attend. It's not a question of if, but when. Of if, and yet something beautiful persists even in decline. There are PCUSA churches doing incredible work. Food pantries feeding thousands, after-school programs tutoring at-risk kids, refugee resettlement programs helping families fleeing war and persecution, advocacy for the homeless, the imprisoned, the forgotten. Churches partnering with communities to address addiction, poverty, and systemic injustice. The PCUSA's commitment to social justice isn't empty rhetoric. Real people are being helped in real, tangible ways. The question that haunts the denomination is whether those good works justify the institution's continued existence, or whether they could be done just as well, maybe better, without the denominational superstructure. Because that's the uncomfortable question at the heart of this story. Does the world need the Presbyterian Church USA? Not rhetorical Presbyterianism. The theology, the polity, the tradition. That's alive and well in other Presbyterian bodies. But does the world specifically need this institution that's been fighting with itself for 60 years? The membership numbers suggest the answer is no. People have voted with their feet and they've walked away. But institutional death is a strange thing. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly. Department by department, church by church, presbytery by presbytery. Buildings get sold, staff gets reduced, programs get cut, and the people who remain become more committed, more determined, even as the ship sinks beneath them. They're not fools. They know the numbers. But they genuinely believe there's still a purpose, still a mission, still a reason to keep going. Are they right? That's a question each viewer will have to answer for themselves. What we can say for certain is this. The collapse of the Presbyterian Church USA is one of the most significant religious stories of the last half-century, and most Americans have no idea it happened. While media focuses on evangelical megachurches and religious political activism, an entire branch of American Protestantism quietly collapsed. The churches that educated presidents and founded universities, that helped shape American democracy and culture, that built the beautiful stone buildings that still dot every American town, those churches are dying. Not from scandal or corruption, but from something more complex and more tragic. From being unable to hold together people who fundamentally disagreed about the nature of truth, authority, and the very purpose of the church itself. The Presbyterian Meltdown is a story about the limits of democracy in religious life. It's a story about the cost of culture war. It's a story about institutional decline in an age of individualism. It's a story about what happens when the center cannot hold, when compromise becomes impossible, when every issue becomes an existential battle. And it's a story that's still being written. The PCUSA still exists. It still has over 1 million members. It still operates. But everyone knows where this is heading. The trajectory is clear. Short of a miracle, and Presbyterians would debate what that word even means, the denomination will continue shrinking until it reaches a point of unsustainability. Maybe that's in 10 years, maybe 20, maybe 50, but it's coming. The final irony? Both sides were partly right. The progressives were right that culture changes and the church must engage contemporary issues with compassion and nuance. The conservatives were right that abandoning traditional teaching and biblical authority cost the church its theological center. Both were also partly wrong. The progressives underestimated how much their changes would alienate committed members. The conservatives underestimated how much their rigidity would repel younger generations. And in the end, both got exactly what they feared most: a dying church that satisfies neither traditional believers nor contemporary seekers. This is how institutions die. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. Not in a single catastrophic event, but in 1,000 small decisions that seemed reasonable at the time. The Confession of 1967, the ordination of women, the debates over sexuality, the merger, the splits, the lawsuits, none of them alone killed the Presbyterian Church USA. Together they were fatal. And the saddest part, everyone saw it happening. Reports were written, alarms were raised, committees were formed, and nothing could stop the slow-motion collapse. Because you can't compromise on what you believe is truth, and you can't build a church when half the members think the other half is betraying Jesus. So there it is. The story of how the Presbyterian Church lost 1 million members. Actually closer to 3 million, but who's counting anymore? It's a cautionary tale for every institution facing internal conflict. It's a warning about the cost of culture war. It's a reminder that sometimes both sides of a debate can be sincere, committed, and wrong about what they think will save them. And it's a eulogy for a church that once helped build America and now can barely sustain itself. The Presbyterian Church USA isn't dead yet, but the funeral is being planned and everyone's invited. Whether anyone will come is another question entirely. If this deep dive into religious decline and institutional collapse fascinated you as much as it did me, hit that like button and subscribe to Professor Archive. We go deep on the historical moments that shaped our world. And if you really want to support the work we do, that super thanks button helps more than you know. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep digging into the archives of history. The truth is always more complex than the headlines suggest.